First slide here, we have obviously the title slide, the biology of the great crested newt, Triturus cristatus. First thing, as we discussed in the presentation video, is this needs to be properly formatted, this Latin name. So that means we need to capitalize the genus, and we need to italicize the whole species name. And if I wanted to be really particular about this title, I would say the great crested newt is the full name, and that shouldn't go across 2 lines to make it easier to read. So why not just change the formatting of that title slightly to make it the biology of the great crested newt. Hang on. There we go. Across the 2 lines. Yeah, that makes it a bit easier to read. Okay, the next thing, the next thing about this slide is that it has my name, but just my first name. Why not make it a bit more formal? Why not say, put my full name there, Chris Harvey, and if I wanted to give my title or something like that, I could do that, but I might just want to say School of Human and Life Sciences. And what's also often good practice is putting the date of the presentation into your slides, because if you're doing this as an interview or as a conference presentation, you want to put the date in there to record the occasion. So in my case now, it's the 27th of January 2020, and it's not showing up because it's behind this picture. There we go, which brings me to this picture. It's kind of quirky, it's kind of funny, but it doesn't really look very professional, and it doesn't really communicate much about the species, because cartoons are by nature distorted. So my recommendation would be to take this out, and if anything, I might want to put a picture of a newt here on the cover slide to show what the animal looks like. So, and we have some in the slides here, in the other slides of the presentation. So why not take this image that was used in the background here, for example? So I'm going to take this one, copy it, and I'm going to move that to this slide here. Okay. Now it's too big; it's going to cover the whole front of the slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce that in size and put that right here. Now there we go. Nice, simple, easy to read title, properly formatted Latin name. It's got my full name in here. I could even probably make my name in bold to make it stand out a bit more. There we go. And it's got the date. And you might even want to put in, if this is for a particular module, you could do, you know, the animal husbandry module or ecology and conservation, whatever it might be. You can put that in here. Yeah, there we go. That's much better. There we go. Much nicer, much clearer kind of title slide. Now, in terms of the background formatting, white is clear, plain, easy to read. So in terms of communicating things, it's really very effective with the black text on top. But you'll see lots of different opinions as to what color schemes you should use. Personally, my personal preference is to have some kind of color background to give it just a little bit more visual appeal, but others will disagree with that. This is perfectly up to you how you want to format the color scheme, as long as it's easy to read, easy to make sense of what the letters and read them against the background and so forth. So we're not going to change that now. We're going to just keep the black and white for now for simplicity's sake. Okay, on to the next slide. So these slides split opinions as well. If you ask me, and I think if you ask most people, this kind of slide where you lay out the contents of your presentation are most of the time not necessary at all, especially in the context of a presentation that you're going to be delivering as part of an assignment. The reason being that those presentations usually are only about 10 minutes long, 15 minutes on the very outside. So using a half a minute or even a minute to just state what the contents of your presentation are going to be is not a very effective use of your time. Okay? You have other things you could talk about in those 10 minutes that are much more useful for the audience to hear. The second thing is that if you're delivering a presentation as part of a set of 20 presentations that a whole group of students have done, all of you will have worked on the same assessment brief, right? So you'll all know what roughly should be in one of these presentations because you've all done one. So there's no real point telling the others in my group, here's what the structure of my presentation is going to be like, because they will all know it already. So again, you're telling them things they already know, which is not very effective communication. If this was a research presentation and you were actually going to present about a topic of your research, for example, usually, again, I would say you don't need this kind of slide because most research presentations are on the same structure. Introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion. Everyone knows that. So if I'm at a conference and I see someone with a slide that tells me, hey guys, my presentation is going to have an introduction, then I'm going to have some materials and methods, then I'm going to have some results, and then we're going to have a discussion, that's 30 seconds of my life I'm never going to get back. Okay? So instead, just tell me about your topic, get me into it. That's what I want to see first. So this whole slide could be deleted, but even if you wanted to keep it, these pictures here, all these cartoons, are not necessary. And in fact, even if these were in other slides, say for example this nice little fella here was somewhere on another slide, right? Say for example the next slide here. Cartoons are most of the time not a really good communication tool. First of all, because they might visually trivialize what you're trying to say. You're trying to communicate some kind of hard fact, some kind of crucial piece of information to your audience, and by putting a funny, quirky cartoon on there, it almost undermines that point. It makes it look less serious, makes it look less important. So I would advise against using cartoons and kind of cartoony elements in general. There can be rare situations, if it's really effectively used and actually makes sense in the context of your presentation, where it can come in useful and can be very powerful. But by and large, the rule of thumb is all these kind of cutesy pictures and cartoons and so forth are not adding much to your presentation and are just going to be clutter that is not going to help. Okay, on to the next slide. What is a great crested newt and why is it so important to study its biology, especially in the UK and elsewhere in Europe? Now the first thing that's obvious about this slide is that it has an incredible imbalance between the title, all of this is the title, and then this little bit down here is the actual information down here on the slide. So the first thing is your titles, if you're going to have titles on slides, and there could even be an argument made that some slides don't need a title at all, but if you are going to have titles, make them short and punchy so that they just flag up the key thing that you're going to be talking about for the next minute, okay? And again, remember, it shouldn't be a title that tells people what they're going to be reading about, because they shouldn't really be reading your slides. They should be listening to you as you use the slide as an aid to point out things. So the title should just be there to tell people, I'm going to be talking about this thing right now. So here, for example, why is the great crested newt so important, or what is it, and why do we need to study it, and so forth? That's a lot of stuff to cram onto a single slide. I would probably argue you'd want to maybe split this up into 2 or 3 slides. A slide on its biology, maybe a slide on its importance, right? So you could split this up into multiple slides, but if you want to keep this to one slide, I would say you could probably cut this down to biology, and importance. And you can even specify that further and say ecological importance. Okay, so now we have a much shorter title. Probably squeeze that onto a single line. There we go. That's much better. And I can just tuck that up here, nice and centered. And that makes that slide much tidier and gives me much more space to work with in terms of my actual content. So the second point here is that the font size of my actual text is much too small. So I said that you don't want people to read the slides necessarily while you're talking, but the slide should be there to highlight certain points to the people without having to do much reading. So a small font like this is really not very useful. So I'd say the minimum font you should be using is somewhere, if we highlight this, is somewhere in the probably 20 to 24 region, right? The rule of thumb is the slide itself should communicate whatever key points you want to bring across in this particular instance, and then choose the font size as big as possible to suit that. So if you only have 3 bullet points on a slide, then go full on big text, okay? Go really nice and big so people can really see what the key points are. Never use any, so if I just go to 20, you can see all the space here is unused. So these were my 2 points. that would be a really bad font size to choose. Another rule of thumb is, should the font size be different between the title of the slide and the body of the text? And that it should definitely be the case. So for example, if I choose a font size here of 80, now the text here is bigger than my actual title of the slide, and that is visually just very confusing. So always make sure that your text on the slide, in the body of your text, is smaller than the title, so that it visually doesn't clash. Okay? So let's say here, for example, 32 is a good size, and let's see what we have here in terms of the text. Do we need all this text? So, because you look at this is a wall of text, just a lot of stuff to read through, and people will not be able to pick out any of the key points you're trying to talk about on this slide. So, the great crested newt is an amphibian, a member of the class Amphibia. Okay, that's an interesting factoid. Maybe that's something we want to flag up to people, depending on what level we're at. If this was a level 6 presentation, I might even assume that people know it's an amphibian. Okay, I might be more specific here and say what group of this of the amphibians, right? What subcategory, what taxonomic branch exactly is it on? But for a first year presentation, this might be a suitable point to make. So I'd break this down and say the great crested newt is an amphibian, member of the class Amphibia. You could shorten this down a little bit by taking out a member of the, right? If we take this out, it just says class Amphibia. That's just as clear, and we've saved on some words. So now we have all of our first point in one line. Perfect, okay? So we can make a nice gap for the next line. The great crested newt is an amphibian, class Amphibia. Now it says here, it is found across Central and Eastern Europe. It has 4 legs and a tail, and so on. So the next key point we might want to make here is that it is found across Central and Eastern Europe. Okay? So found across Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, that's the next point. Short, simple, to the point. Next point is it has 4 legs and a tail and spends most of its life in ponds where it also breeds. It can be distinguished from other newts by the crest on the back and the adult male and the bright orange underside with black blotches. So it has 4 legs and a tail. Again, you might want to argue that is something we should know about amphibians at this stage. But if you want to make that point, I'd say this point is much better made verbally by speaking than by putting it in writing, because it's so obvious. So you could say, for example, at the beginning of the slide, well, the great crested newt is an amphibian, class Amphibia, which of course means it has 4 legs and it has a tail, like all members of the Amphibia do. Okay, so that would be something you can take out here. And then the next point we have is it spends most of its life in ponds where it also breeds. So that could be another point. Spends most of its life in ponds where it also breeds. Now, is that really true? Well, the content I'm going to leave to a side for the moment, but the newt does spend quite a lot of time on land as well. So whether that point is entirely correct is another matter. But let's just leave it at that. Spends much of its life in ponds where it also breeds. Okay? And then it says here, it can be distinguished from other newts by the crest and the back of the adult males, the bright orange underbelly, underside here. I'm going to move this to the side, with black blotches. So, again, we can shorten this down. We can just say the key features are it has crest on the back of the adult males and bright orange underside with black blotches. Okay, there we go. And the main breeding season is spring from March to June. Okay, now, this is again a small point, but look at the organization of this information. Okay, so we go from very basic information that it is an amphibian and its shape, it has a tail and 4 legs, very good. Then we go to its distribution, where is it found across Central and Eastern Europe. And then it says here spends most of its life in ponds where it also breeds, okay, telling us a bit about biology. But then it tells us about identification, how we can tell it apart from other organisms. And then it goes back again to... Oh, sorry, I had to pause there for a second. Phil just popped into the office. So, okay, let's carry on. Where were we? Yeah, so the organization of the information here isn't great, because after we talk about the shape and the identifying features of the great crested newt, we then go back to the breeding again. So here's breeding, and then we skip it, and then we have another bit on breeding. So it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. So I think the best thing to do here would be to take this information, because it relates to the shape and the appearance, and move that up here with the other information about the shape and appearance, which is that it's an amphibian with a tail and 4 legs. Then we can maybe talk about the distribution found across Central and Eastern Europe, and then we can have the information about it spending its life in ponds, where it also breeds, and the main breeding season is spring from March to June. There we go. So that's fairly straightforward. If I want to tidy this up a little bit, again, you can see here how the word June is just standing on its own here down at the bottom. So it will make it easier to say, if we just move this down here, the main breeding season is spring from March to June. Again, little things, but all this contributes to the clarity of your slides. Now, finally, the last thing we have here is this picture here. Shows someone handling a newt. Now, if I put this into the presentation mode, you'll see this slide has a really nasty animation that you saw in the other video. So let's just have another look at that, just to see what that looks like. Let's go on to the next slide. Yeah, look at that animation. Okay, going all over the place, flashing, fading in and out, and all kinds of stuff. So we don't need that at all. It could even be debated whether or not this image is really useful, because always think about the images as supportive of whatever you're trying to communicate on that slide. So what are we trying to communicate on this slide? We're telling people that the great crested newt is an amphibian, that it has 4 legs and a tail. Does that picture show this? Yeah, pretty much. You can just see the tail here. We've got the legs, right? But it's pretty easy to imagine what 4 legs and a tail look like. So do we really need a picture to tell us what that looks like? Secondly, this newt is quite dark and is quite uniform in its color, so it can't really see a lot about the anatomical detail. Then the second point here is that the great crested newt has a crest on the back of the adult males and a bright orange underside with black blotches. Now, is that easy to imagine? Not really. What does that crest look like? What do these blotches look like? How strongly orange are they? So here, this could be illustrated with a picture, and that would be much more powerful in terms of helping the imagination of the listeners along. Then it says here, found across Central and Eastern Europe. Well, that's a bit vague. Could you maybe have a distribution map of that? That might be a more useful image to go along with this slide. And then it says here, spends most of its life in ponds, where it also breeds, and the main breeding season is the spring from March to June. Neither of those two statements would greatly benefit from having an image on the slide. So if you ask me, the best way you could communicate the content of this slide is by having either a picture of a adult male newt with a crest and or a picture of the underside with the blotches to point this out to your listeners, or have a map with a distribution across Central and Eastern Europe. But I would probably argue that is a strong enough point to make a whole slide of it on its own. But let's say, for example, we want to get a picture of the crest and of the underside with the black blotches. So I'm going to remove this picture because it's not that informative, and I'm going to go to my Google and I'm going to type in great crested newt, and I'm going to look for for images. Okay, so I'm going to search for that. I'm going to click on images, and you'll get a whole bunch of various different pictures. And again, it's worthwhile thinking about the source of the picture, how reliable that is, right? So, for example, let's look at some of the sources of these pictures. WildlifeTrusts.org. Do you think they will know a lot about great crested newts? Probably, because they're a target species for conservation, so Wildlife Trusts will have a lot of interest in communicating about the great crested newt. Here we have a picture from the Telegraph. Now this one isn't so good because it doesn't have the crest on the male. This must be a female. But this one has the crest. Look at that, lovely one. It's from the Telegraph. Now the Telegraph is a newspaper. You should think that newspapers do proper research and know what they're printing, but I wouldn't be so sure. They're not as reliable as, say, a scientific organization. So handle it with care. I wouldn't necessarily use this one, but let's keep going. Norfolk Wildlife Trust, the Telegraph again, right? So these are all bargatehomes.co.uk. I would certainly not want to use a .co.uk website because those are commercial websites. They have no interest in necessarily in accuracy. They might have a strong bias around them. And then we have Wikipedia here, which again I wouldn't necessarily trust. So, but if I look at all these, the one that looks most attractive to me is the Natural England picture here, because Natural England is a government organization, .gov.uk. it's run by by experts in the field, and because it's the government, and it's a wildlife organization run by the government, it should be, again, fairly neutral and fairly well resourced and fairly well staffed and fairly well sorted out. So I would rely on this one probably most out of all of them. And I can click on that, and it'll take me to the picture, right? And then what I want to do is I can copy this picture, and I can pop it into my presentation. Yeah, here we go. And again, I want to remember to reference this properly. So I'm just going to take the URL here, and I'm going to pop that underneath that picture. Okay. And here's a handy little trick. First of all, the references don't have to be huge, right? So this is quite large text. If I want to make it a little bit smaller so I can fit more on the slide, I can just set this size down to 10, for example. So I just highlight my text and make it down to 10. So anyone who's interested in the reference can see that it's there and can look it up later if they want to by looking at my slides, but it doesn't actually interfere with the text on the rest of the page, right? Because you can imagine, if I take this link and I make the size of it, say, 18, now it's almost competing with the other text on the slide for visibility, and that's not great. So let's keep it at 10. Another top tip is, if you want to click on the image, and then if I hold the control button on my keyboard down, you'll see this little plus image that appears on the mouse. You see that? How it goes from being a normal mouse indicator to a little plus symbol. If that happens, and I keep my finger on the control button on my keyboard, I can click on another object, and I can highlight multiple objects in my PowerPoint. And now what I can do is I can go to group these items. So if I go to home, I think it's somewhere down here, or if I right-click, hang on, let's try this. Right-click and then click on group. Yeah. If I click on that, it'll now create a group of these things. So whenever I move the picture around, the reference is going to go with it. Okay, perfect. So now I can't lose that. Okay. Now, and if I shrink this down, you'll see that the text will kind of move with it, right? So that's great. And I can still move things individually within that group if I want to by clicking on the little bits of it. Okay, so we're going to come back to this in a second. So now we have the crest and the male. That's very clear. We don't have the underside yet. So something like this here on this slide, right? So again, can we get a nice clear image of that? Well, let's look back at our image results. So is there anyone here? acerecology.co, that's probably an environmental consultancy. That's not great. One that I seem to, that seems to be quite good is the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Again, it's a wildlife trust, so it should be fairly reliable. And this one seems to have a really nice underside picture of the newt. So I'm going to copy this one, and I'm going to pop it into here. Okay, now you can see what I really want to show in this image is just this part of the animal, the underside. The tail isn't even that important because I have that already in the other image. So I can crop this image. So to crop this image, just click on the image, go to Format, and go to Crop. And then you can just, with these little boxes that appear around the edges, these little brackets, you can drag those and just make the picture much, much smaller. Essentially the size you really want it to be. So if I go like this, boom. Yeah, that shows me the underside of the newt really nicely, and now I can make this smaller. And this way I can fit this probably a lot nicer on my slide. So for example, how do I fit all this onto the slide? Well, if I put my image here, and maybe here, and then we'll rearrange this in a second, I can now see that I can move this text down, putting in some spaces. Great, create some space here. And down here, ponds where it also breeds. Okay, so now we've created some nice space. I can also move the spring. Yeah, down here, just delete out those spaces. There we go. Now that's created some nice space for me to move my images around in. So I can actually make this a little bit smaller. Don't want to make the images too small so people can't see what I'm talking about. But this now looks a little bit nicer. Okay, maybe I can even make this a bit smaller and move this a bit over here and make this a little bit bigger again. Oh, keep the aspect ratio correct. There we go. So now we fit our text onto this slide fairly nicely. We've got our pictures here. Now again, we might want to rearrange this like so, make this a bit smaller. There we go. Now these two images clearly underline this statement here, illustrated, and it's much easier to visualize that for the audience. Now I still have to add the reference for this picture. So if I go to the website, yeah, I can take this link and pop it into here again, and I can make the text smaller, and then I can just wrap that around here, so again it fits in nicely with the rest of the stuff. And then the last thing I would say about this slide is you have these big gaps between these. Now I've done this deliberately. I've created these gaps because this is one set of information, the appearance of the organism. This is another bit of information, the distribution, and this is a third set of information, which is its life, its habits, its reproductive cycle, and so forth. So I would say you could probably reduce the size of these a little bit, and one way to doing that, an easy way of doing that, is to just click on that line and then reduce the font size. So instead of having a 32, have a 14. Okay, and that will move those things a little bit together. Still have that gap that separates them for the audience, but makes them a bit closer together. Now, this is a slide now that I would say is on the very fringes of what I would deem acceptable in terms of the amount of text on a slide. You probably want to aim for a little bit less than this, but this is probably just about as much as a slide can handle. As I said earlier, if it was up to me, I'd probably say take this point, take it out, and make a new slide, which is literally the distribution of the Great Crested Newt with a big, nice distribution map over here. Like this one here, for example. Well, that's not a great map. We'll talk about that in a moment. But something like that, right? So a slide in and of itself. And it's nice to have a slide in there that's just an image, maybe with a title on top, which you just use to support whatever you're saying visually. Not every slide has to have text on it. Okay? So keep that in mind. Okay. So that's that slide. Let's move on to, so we've talked about this and how you would create one for the map. Now, we talked about the issue around videos. Don't do that. I would take this whole slide out altogether. It doesn't serve any purpose. Now we go on to the next slide. Now, in this case, I mean, I've seen presentations where the entire presentation looks like this, right? A really busy, noisy background, maybe a really striking color scheme, and then nastily colored text on top that is almost impossible to read. So you definitely want to avoid that. The easiest way to avoid that is do one of two things. Take out the background altogether, the background image, or if you're desperate to keep it in because you think it's really a visual allure and all this kind of stuff, you can change the strength of that image by right-clicking it and going on Format Picture, and then going on, well, first of all, there's corrections you can do to the picture. So up here on the left, the corrections can be, let's just close that. The corrections can be, you know, a much lighter and more contrast-heavy picture, but that usually won't help you much. What is much better is to format that picture, right-click, and then Format Picture. And then you should be able to, let's have a look here. Picture corrections, yes. So if you go to picture corrections, you can then select the brightness and the contrast, right? So the brightness could be really, really high. The contrast could be really, really low. Okay, so it almost becomes like a very faint background. But even better than that is, so you can still see it's fairly loud, even with these settings now. It's still a bit noisy in the background. So what you can do is set the transparency. Well, it just so happens that I had a look around just for a moment there, and you can actually change the transparency of an image in PowerPoint. So just the more reason not to actually use a picture like this for the background, because this is as good as it'll get using that, and that's not very good. So it's still too busy, too noisy. So I would remove that background, and I would change this text back to what you have in the rest of your presentation, so probably black, something along those lines. This slide again is about distribution in the UK, and this is something that you is picking up on a detail So in the previous slide, you had the distribution in the more European context across Central and Eastern Europe, and now you're going to hone in on the UK. Okay, that's good, but let's see what you say on this slide. So in the UK, great crested newt are found mainly in England and Wales, with no reports from Northern Ireland. The UK population is estimated at 75,000 individuals, and so on. Okay, this is all very nice. What I would say is, again, the text is a bit too small. And be consistent. That's another important thing about presentations. If you're going to choose a visual style, make sure it's consistent across the different slides. So in this case, on this slide, you have bullet points. On this slide, you don't. Why not? Either have no bullet points on all the slides or have bullet points on every slide. It's up to you, but it needs to be consistent. So I'm going to highlight this and add the bullet points in. And be careful, because there's an extra bullet point that's been added here for this new line, which we don't need. Okay, so now, is this picture helping us understand the distribution of the great crested newt in the UK? No. Again, you want to choose images that actually support the narrative, the points you're making on a slide. On the next slide, we have a distribution map with the distribution of the great crested newt. This map would be much better if we just take that out here and put that in here with the other slide. Yeah, it can be on its own slide. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we're going to have a picture on this slide, it might as well be the map. So all I have to do now is rearrange the text a little bit so it'll fit alongside this map. Okay, and again, the text is a bit small, which means we have a lot of empty space down here. So what I would do is I would take this text box and again increase the text size until we're going to use that space nicely. Now that means I'm going to lose some of my text behind the image, so I'm going to go down in and tidy this up a little bit. There we go. Okay, now again, you can see by doing this text size, I'm almost running out of space here on the slide. This is a bit too close to the edge. So what I might do here is just reduce the size a little bit, just bring it down to a 24. There we go. That'll do the trick. Okay. Now, clear information, nice and bullet pointed, with the map alongside it that you can use to point out that distribution. This map is okay, but like we said in the video, other video, it's probably a little bit fuzzy, a little bit pixelated, right? And it also needs a reference. Okay, so again, this would need a reference. Where has this picture been sourced? How reliable is the source? And ideally use a picture that has a better resolution. So let's have a look what we can find in terms of great crested newt. Great crested newt. Let's go down here. Great crested newt UK distribution. If I just go into images, we might be able to find something there. Again, you can see various different organizations here touting their various different survey results. Most of the good results are all going to be from the same source anyway, from the national databases. So let's look at the actual links we have here. Great crested newt. This is from the JNCC, the governmental body in charge of conservation. So let's have a look at this one. This is where the original image came from. So if we wanted to add a reference to that, we would just take this link and add it down here. Oopsie, to our slides. Boom, make it a small font, and off we go. Okay, that's nice and referenced now. But this is the reason this is a bit fuzzy, because if I zoom into this picture, I can see it doesn't have the greatest resolution. Okay, you can see that here. So is there maybe a different link we can use to give us a nice map? Amphibian Reptile Conservation Group. The NBN Atlas, that's the Nature and Biodiversity, the National Biodiversity Atlas. So if we open this one, it might have a good link. Yeah, this is quite good. So here we have a map of the UK. We can zoom into that. Yeah, and it's going to tell us locations where we have an accepted sighting of the great crested newt, records of it, and some unconfirmed ones as well. So again, I can probably zoom into this website a little bit, and it should fix the resolution up for me. It should, yeah, it's not great, but this one might be another suitable map you could use maybe with a little bit less, a bit better resolution. But the point I'm making is, right, by the way, if you can't get this picture, copy this image. Let's see what it'll come up as in PowerPoint. So right click and paste. Yeah, it's just going to give us the dots and not even all the dots, see? Right, so you can't just copy that image. So sometimes you might have to just print the screen. So with the print screen button on the keyboard, take that picture and again, pop it into your PowerPoint and then crop it down to whatever you need. Boom and boom. Okay, and now let's see if that looks any better in terms of resolution. Not much. So yeah, potato, potato. It's up to what you think communicates your story better. Okay, on to the next. So we don't need this slide anymore. Although you could, take this picture and make it a new slide, and then just remove it from this slide and just have the text here and have your picture here. But that will make for a very dull slide here, and it'll add an extra slide to your slideshow you don't necessarily need. So it's a trade-off, right? What you definitely shouldn't do is have a distribution map that's about this size down here in the corner, right? So if your text is really big and busy and you have other points to make, you shouldn't have a tiny little map down here. A map should be a big feature so you can actually see what's going on inside of it, right? Small maps are not a good idea for PowerPoint presentations. Okay, so we'll delete this one out. Then we have the slide on threats. Now again, you can see the title here and the text in the actual body of the presentation are not well aligned. This text should not be larger than the title text here. Okay, that's the first thing I'm going to fix. I'm going to take this text, make it nice and big, I don't know, a 60, and then I'm going to take this stuff here and make it a reasonable size. So maybe, I don't know, 28. Okay, that's better. So, on the one hand, this slide is really quite nice because it's got nice bullet pointed highlights, key points, diseases, road deaths, habitat loss, climate change, clear itemization of the threats this organism is facing, and you can then elaborate on each of those points in speaking in your presentation. Okay? The thing that kind of is the problem with this slide is that this text here, that is the actual key point, is being overshadowed by the size of the reference, the wording of the reference, right? So we have very few words for our actual point and lots of words for our reference, which means I, as an audience member, if I want to follow along the points you're making, I'm going to get totally distracted by the amount of words that are in this reference. Now, there's multiple ways of fixing this. The first thing you could do is just take the reference text and make it smaller. Okay, so instead of having 28, I'm going to make it a 10, like I did with the text font size on the images. Now, you might say, Chris, that's cheating. You can't do that. You just said my text has to be a suitable, legible size. And that's absolutely true. But the references are not a key part of the text on your slide. They're important to support the points you're making, but they're not in and of themselves points you're making. They're supporting the points you're making, right? So what's important for the audience to know is there is a reference here that's backing up this text. And you can even read it if you really want to have a look here. Oh, that's the reference, Downey Larcom instead. But it doesn't distract in terms of its size and positioning from the actual point you're making here. So that's one thing you could do. You could go through the whole row of things here and make the references smaller. Okay? So I could do something like this, yeah, and there we go. Now my points are coming across much more clearly. They're much more emphasized, and the reference is an afterthought or just a footnote to that major point. That's one way of doing it, but you could argue that still could be quite busy. You still have this little thing, and people might be curious. What is that? Let's squint and have a look at that instead of focusing on your points. So what's often done in presentations is people use the Vancouver style referencing. Now, I know in your assessment briefs and you're studying with us so far, we've always said to you, always use the Harvard style referencing, right? So the Harvard style, like it is here, with the author names and then the year as your citation in the text. I would always check with your lecturer what referencing style they want you to use, but for presentations, personally speaking, I would say it's a good idea to use Vancouver style referencing. Now, what is Vancouver style referencing? Vancouver style referencing works on the basis that you might have, in a body of text or in a presentation, you might have 20 references, let's say. What Vancouver style does is it gives each reference a number. So for example, Downey, Larcombe, and Stead, 2019, might be your first in-text citation you're making here. So it's going to be the first reference in your reference list at the end of the text. So what you could do is you could say, this is going to be my number 1 reference. So that's going to be a 1. And the way that's usually signified is with square brackets. So I'm going to replace these round brackets with square brackets. Yeah, and then I'm going to make this a superscript. So I'm going to actually type this. Let's change that here altogether. I'm going to type in a square bracket 1, and then I'm going to say make that a superscript. So my font is going to be it doesn't have it here. No. Okay, let's just right click that. Oop. Format. Where is my superscript? Oh, here we go. Right click it. Yeah. Font, format the font, and go superscript. Okay, there we go. Now this little 1 here is not distracting from my diseases as much, and I could even make it a bit smaller in the font, so I could make it maybe a 20. Okay, there we go. Now it says diseases square brackets 1. So at the end of your text you will then have a reference list on your last slide, which is missing in this case. Well, there's 1 here. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then you'll have a numbered list of the full references in your reference list at the end of the slide. There's numbered 1, 2, 3, and you can reuse these numbers. So if I have the 1 here for this one, I can reuse it for the next row. Okay, that's also going to be the 1. Okay, and I can do it here as well. And again, all I want to make sure is that this is all consistently formatted, and the way that you do that is you can click into here, click Format Painter, and then it'll just format everything the same way. There we go. And the last one, yeah, let's pop that in here. Whoopsie, that's really come out weird. So Format Painter and Format Painter. Okay, there we go. That's much easier, much clearer. Now I have all this space I've freed up here that I can use to put in relevant pictures. For example, a picture of a diseased newt. Maybe even a picture of a flattened newt on a road, although that's maybe a bit graphic, and you can probably imagine that quite easily. But habitat loss, maybe there you could show a map that shows how the distribution of the great crested newt has decreased in certain areas because of habitat loss. So there's a whole bunch of space you've freed up here that you can use now to illustrate the points you're making. Okay, there's one more point I want to make about this slide and the referencing here. What you will notice is that the, hang on, I'm just going to fix this flashing thing here. There we go. One thing you'll notice is that these points are all referenced with the same source. It's all the same paper. Now maybe that paper is a really good review paper that covers lots of aspects of the great crested newt. However, it's good practice in the sciences to support what you're saying with a range of different sources, a range of different literature, right? Because one source might be wrong. So if you keep relying on that one source, it tells us, first of all, you haven't read a huge amount around the topic, and secondly, what if that source is not very good and you've relied on it so extensively? So it'd be good to show that you've read a couple of other papers that support some of the points you've made here. So maybe there's a couple of papers that have talked about diseases. Maybe there's another paper that you've read that's about road deaths. Maybe the first one is the first paper is still relevant for habitat loss, and then you have another paper altogether for climate change. Now this looks much better referenced and much better supported, and it shows us that you've read a lot more around the topic. That's really positive and good practice. So again, try to reference widely, try to use different sources to support your points. Okay, brings me to my next to last slide, the conservation slide. Okay, so that was announced up here in the superfluous structure slide about the talk, but here it is. Now, on the one hand, I said earlier that it's nice to have slides in your presentation that just have images or just have an image on them. That if you can talk about that image and it supports your narrative, that's really useful. But then there's images that are useful to communicating things and images that are not useful to communicating things. And sometimes it might seem to you that if I say make sure you illustrate your slides with relevant images, that just means, well, I've got to have lots of images in there that make it like really popping and interesting and stuff to look at and keep the audience interested. That's not always the case. So in this case, for example, we have a slide called conservation, and we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 various different pictures of various different newts. Very busy, very cluttered. None of those pictures tell us anything new about the great crested newt and what it does. We've seen all the, the main features already on the second slide. So these pictures are not telling us anything new, they're just filler, right? So my advice would be take all of these out. None of them have any meaning in relation to conservation of the great crested newt. But this picture here is much more important and much more interesting in this context, and that should really be given center stage here for this particular slide. So I'll reduce the text size for the reference here again. That's really good. It's from an actual scientific paper, right? You can see that by the article. So in that case, if it's from an actual scientific article, don't give us the link. That's only for images, right? This is an image in a sense, but it's a diagram, a figure from a paper. So you want to give us the actually properly referenced paper for that. And you can see here, I've put in the link here. This is the paper from Landscape Ecology, May 2015, volume 30. So it's Astrid J. A. van Tiefelen and so on, all the other authors. So I can get the citation, cite article, how to cite. There we go. There we go. Here's my reference. Okay. I'm not going to use the full reference. I'm going to keep that for my reference slide down here. So I'll pop that into here for now. But you can see here it's Van Tiefelen et al. There's numerous authors, and 2015 is the year. So if I was going to use Harvard style, which I'm perfectly entitled to do, I would go Van Tief. How many T's? How many E's? 2 E's, 2 F's. Van Tiefelen. Van Tiefelen et al. 2015. Okay. Pop that over here, and the et al. Would be italicized in the Harvard style, I believe. Yeah. So now, this is if it's the actual reference, you can make this a little bit bigger. Let's give this a, I don't know, a 14. Okay. Still quite small, non-obtrusive. There we go. Nice little reference. If I wanted to use my Vancouver style referencing, here we go. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 papers referenced so far. So this would be number 5. So square brackets, number 5. Okay. Boom. There we go. The title, again, consistency. Keep the title the same size for every slide. So if here you have a 60 point font for this title should also be a 60-point font. Keep it as consistent as possible within reason, okay? Now, if you just have this image here on the slide, fine, you can talk about it, you can point out what these things mean, but for a diagram that's as busy as this and as complicated as this, I personally would probably want to have a couple of reminders on the slide of what I should be talking about. So I might put in here point 1, point 2, oops, there we go, and point 3. Okay. That then jog my memory when I'm talking, when I'm presenting. Oh, these are the things I wanted to mention about this particular set of diagrams. Okay. Again, keep the text as limited as possible so it doesn't distract from the actual power of this set of diagrams, right? But it's good. This is good work because a scientific paper, a peer-reviewed paper has been used. This is probably a very well supported figure that's really informative around the conformation of the great crested newt and its decline and so forth. So really useful, okay? But the image will not speak for itself. You need to explain it, and you need to give, ideally, a couple of points here that the audience can kind of hang on to while you're talking about the diagram, about what the key messages are from this picture. Okay. brings me to my last slide. Now, if this was a 10-minute presentation, this person currently has 8 slides. I'd say usually it's a minute per slide, but there's a couple of slides here, the title slide and the structure slide. This one I would take out, right? So we lose this one. This one only takes about 10 seconds to do. Hello, my name is Chris. I'm going to do a presentation about the Great Crested Newt. So really we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slides, and the rule of thumb is each slide will take you about a minute to 2 minutes to talk about, depending on your pace, depending on how much information there is on each slide. So for a 10-minute presentation, this might already be all you need, right? Because if you're spending 2 minutes talking about this one, 2 minutes about this one, 2 minutes about this one, that'll take you to your 10 minutes. So keep the number of slides limited if possible, but don't be shy to use multiple slides for quick, short points you want to make, okay? That's just a rule of thumb, a minute per slide usually. Okay, finally, the reference slide, okay? Now, I pointed out in the video on the presentation itself that it's really important not to just come to a dead stop at the reference slide. There should be some kind of conclusion slide, some kind of a takeaway message, something at the end that the audience can kind of say, okay, now we're, it's like a roller coaster ride, right? You take off at the beginning into the introduction. Wow, you learn all this stuff, loops and roundabouts and ups and downs, and and then you come to the end, and suddenly you fall off a cliff if there's no conclusion slide. So the conclusion slide is like on a roller coaster. When you pull back into the station at the roller coaster, everyone slows down, everyone takes a deep breath and goes like, oh, okay, that's what all this was about. That's what the conclusion slide is for, okay? Or it could be a summary slide, whatever you want to call it. Summary could be looking ahead, it could be whatever you want to call it, some sense of we're coming to the end of our presentation. Let me just sum things up for you. Let me just give you a perspective on what to think about next, whatever it might be, okay? Only then should you have a reference slide. And ideally, what's nice to have in here as well is a thank you slide. So a thank you for your attention. And if you want to have cartoons or anything like that anywhere in your presentation, this is the place to put them, at the end. Because now you've communicated your information, the audience knows the presentation is over, so nothing you put on this slide is going to be distracting in any way, so you can just put in a nice cartoon of a newt, and that's fine. If you want to make a nice little quirky ending, it's up to you. It doesn't have to be the case, whatever is your preferred style. Okay, and then at the very end you have your reference slide. Now the reference slide is usually only there for people who want to check it, like us, the people who assess your work. But also audience members who want to then come up to you after the presentation, at a conference for example, and say, what was that thing you said about that method you used? Which paper was that from? And then you can go to your reference list and quickly tell them what that reference was. That's the reason that is there most of the times. So this reference list is really bad because, first of all, it's very short, and it's good to have at least a handful of references, 5, 6, 7, 10, something like that. That'd be a really nice number of references. And the reason it's not great is because this reference here, this scientific article that was the source for this picture here, has not been fully referenced according to either Harvard or Vancouver style, right? So just giving us the web link is not a fully formatted proper reference. So you should look into the Harvard referencing guide if you're going to use Harvard style. If you're going to use Vancouver style, look into the Vancouver formatting style, how you would enter that reference in full at the end of a text, right? That stuff is all online for you to look at. I'm not going to go over that here, but it has to be properly formatted. And the second thing is, here we have another reference. That one is better. That is a fully referenced, probably not entirely Harvard style, so because landscape ecology is coming before 2015, so it should be something like this, right? Landscape ecology. Well, it's missing the title, first of all. That's not a very good reference. So whoever's uploading these references is doing a really bad job. So that just tells you this reference is not very good. It's missing the title of the paper. Okay? So how do I get that one? If I don't want to use a referencing software like Mendeley or whatever and download the citation, right? I can download the various different database entries. If you know how to use referencing software, you can use that. If not, I would just take the title, go to my Google Scholar, scholar.google.com, and then paste in the title, and it'll come up with the actual paper, and then it has little citation marks here. See that? Cite. So you can click on that, and you can see the various different citation styles, including Harvard and Vancouver. Okay? So for example, in my case, because I've used Vancouver, I would copy this. I would copy this, put it over here, replace that with this. Now remember, I have to, in Vancouver style, I have to number the references. So which number was this? Well, it was is that the one? Let's have a look. Yeah, that's the Van Tafelen one. So, and this here should be the number 5 reference. Yeah, there we go. That's Vancouver style referencing, okay? If it was Harvard style, I would go in here and I would copy the Harvard style reference. And again, I would double check that, because not every, this is going to sound crazy, but not every Harvard style is the same Harvard style. So I would copy this, and then I would double check it against the university citation referencing guide, which you can find, of course, on Blackboard. Let me just show you. On Blackboard. And you'll find it right here. Cite them right. Harvard referencing. Okay, that'll take you through to all the rules you will need to know about Harvard referencing style. Okay, that was a fairly lengthy but hopefully useful run through of how you can polish your presentation, at least the slides component of it, to make for a better, easier to read, easier to follow, easier to enjoy presentation for your audience.